All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started here. So, thank you everyone for joining today. Our webinar today presented by MEPFA, the Maryland Eviction Prevention Funds Alliance, on how Maryland can prevent homelessness, keep kids in school, and save money in other fiscal areas. I'm the host today, Musab Ibrahim, the Senior Research Assistant at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. We are part member of the MEPFA Coalition. And I'm happy to introduce our panelists today, beginning with Lisa Sorrow, the Anne Arundel Community Development Services Director, as well as Tanika Richardson with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy is my colleague, and Matt Hill with the Public Justice Center. Next slide, please. And so today, what are we going to cover? We're going to cover three topics today. The first is, what are eviction prevention funds and why do we need eviction prevention funding? The second, we'll be reviewing our recent report conducted with Stout, Risius, and Ross on the need for eviction prevention funding in Maryland. And finally, we'll wrap up with our MEPFA campaign for eviction prevention funds for the General Assembly in 2024. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Lisa.
Good afternoon, everybody. First, one quick correction. I am, in fact, Lisa Sorrow with ACDS, but I'm general counsel, not the director for our program. We have a wonderful director named Erin Karpowitz. That is not me, but I have been involved at the ACDS program, working with the eviction prevention program since COVID started. So I am here to kick it off today to talk about what eviction prevention funds are and why we need them. So eviction prevention funds, as the slide indicates, pay 1 to 3 months of past due rent for families facing short-term crisis. This is intended to ensure that a missed month's rent won't result in the ultimate crisis of homelessness. Maryland has an estimated need for $40 million in eviction prevention funds to stop the eviction of roughly 15,000 families that are currently at highest risk of homelessness in Maryland. So due to eviction. So it's important to distinguish between the COVID rental assistance programs, which most people are most familiar with, because that's the first time really that we've seen eviction prevention funding in our state. And so that program was designed to respond to an overwhelming need by a huge number of our population with an ongoing income crisis. So that program provided lots of funding. We got lots of dollars from the federal government. Several months of rental assistance could be provided, both to cover arrears and future rent. That is not the program that is contemplated in a post-COVID world for eviction prevention funding. Eviction prevention funding sort of 2.0 as we move forward out of COVID and into our new normal is designed to provide basically a lifeline to people who are already living on the edge and may have experienced a temporary crisis, could even be as low as $500 that could knock some entire families for a loop and ultimately result in their homelessness. This type of program is designed to help those families overcome that temporary financial hardship so that they can get back on their feet and continue on without the trauma and everything that comes with an eviction. So if we look at the next slide, you will see why we are looking at a need for eviction prevention funds going forward. So when this slide was prepared in late last year, the latest month of available data for evictions in Maryland was October. So through October of 2023, we were already reaching, nearly reaching pre-pandemic eviction numbers. I checked just before our presentation today, and we have blown past that 19,000 number for all of 2019, and we are currently at 20,606 evictions. That is an average of 62 evictions per day in Maryland, and that's only through November. We don't even have December numbers yet. So the need is huge. And we know that eviction prevention funding can prevent evictions. We've been doing it for the last, 3.5 years during the COVID crisis. So one more thing before I move on to a little bit of a different topic. The numbers that we're seeing right now are really an undercount of evictions in the state that would have happened, but for lingering eviction prevention funds from COVID and then from programs that are still running emergency rental assistance programs. So, for example, several jurisdictions still had funds available in early 2023 and were preventing evictions. And our program here in Anne Arundel County prevented more than 1,000 evictions in 2023. So the numbers we're seeing are actually artificially low for 2023. So who do these numbers represent? Who are the 20,000 families who were evicted last year in our state? By a long margin, based on the best studies available, they are overwhelmingly families, mostly women of color with children. I watched a webinar this week with the frankly devastating title of Evicting Children, How Babies Bear the Brunt of the Affordable Housing Crisis. Some really horrifying data, to be honest. Professor Carl Gershenson of Princeton's Eviction Lab, which is really the gold standard for researching data on evictions, reported the absolutely gobsmacking finding that the demographic most likely to experience eviction in our country is children, babies really, aged 0 to 4 years old, which is staggering. I knew it was bad, but seeing it on a graph and on paper is, there are no words. Next up, kids 5 to 9, followed by kids 10 to 14. This is a problem that affects children overwhelmingly more than anybody else. There's also a racial component to who is evicted. And our state is not different than the rest of the country. Those most likely to be evicted are Black and brown households, and primarily women, and women with children. So the final point I want to share can't really be shared in the limited time that we have, but it absolutely bears mentioning because many people don't have an understanding of how an eviction actually happens. When people are evicted, the door is locked. They lose the roof over their head, but the door is locked with all their stuff. Everything they own, every personal belonging that they own, tossed out on the street. Kids' toys, diapers, food, everything they've got in the refrigerator, medicine, key documents that help them to maintain their benefits, banking records, everything that they own is tossed out on the street. It's devastating. And of course, there are serious health consequences. The consequences on education for children are staggering. They're lifelong. for little kids that are evicted or even at risk of eviction. The studies show a tremendously negative effect on their school outcomes. Eviction often leads to unemployment, an inability to get the help that people need because they don't have a fixed address. They can't go somewhere to pick up their mail and that. And so not only is there that impact on these families that I can't, in the time that we have, go through how impactful it is. There's an incredible impact on the helpers, on the agencies that are trying to help these families pick up the pieces, the nonprofits, the benevolent groups, the charity organizations, the schools especially, trying to pick up the pieces of for families that have been evicted. They're overwhelmed. In my office, we coordinate the continuum of care organizations in the county, and those are the folks that that are their whole job is to and mission is to prevent homelessness and help people who have become homelessness. They are absolutely overwhelmed, as are our school workers that work with families of children who are homeless. Everyone is absolutely overwhelmed. Their budgets are breaking, and we need to reduce these numbers. And there's a way to do it. And that is where my colleagues here are going to step in through the rest of this presentation to talk about how an investment to prevent evictions will actually save money and relieve the burden on all of the agencies and organizations that are trying to help people who have been evicted. It just makes sense. A dollar spent is $2.39 saved. So with that, I will pass it on to, I believe it's going to be Tanika to speak next.
Thank you, Lisa. So speaking of investment, that was a great segue to kind of talk about this study that the MEPFA coalition kind of put together and worked together with Stout to put out. And the reason why we did this study is one, to kind of quantify the actual need, right? How can we determine the need so that we can know what the acts would be to help kind of shield some of those, or at least prevent some of those evictions that Lisa just talked about. So how do we do this? We use some of the data that's already publicly available from the Maryland's case search, as well as Department of Housing and Community Development. We also conducted interviews with stakeholders and received independent feedback from residents and tenants that were affected from evictions. And from all of that data that we collected, Stout came up with really one possible scenario that we focused on, and that primary focus was to estimate the statewide need for eviction prevention funds for tenant households who were at highest risk of displacement. So these were folks who were kind of at the highest risk, at the highest need, who would benefit from this. You can go to the next slide. I'm on slide 6, Kelly. Thank you. So looking at the themes of stakeholders. So doing some of these interviews that we were talking to folks to try to get like who were at the, kind of on the front lines of folks who were seeing this, and kind of how Lisa was kind of already talk about, like during the pandemic, there was this influx of like money that was coming into the state, and trying to see how folks was handling that and trying to get the money to the residents who needed it the most. So some common themes that came up was creating low barriers and an efficient application process. One of the things that we heard back was pretty much that because there was so much different funding coming in, sometimes like the requirements for folks to meet were different, and sometimes that was confusing. During the pandemic, obviously a lot of things were shut down, so it was really hard for folks to kind of meet some of the requirements for some of the documents that they were asking for. Folks couldn't get a hold of. So if they needed birth certificates, socials, pay stubs, like that, those type of things they couldn't get because their employer was shut down. So that kind of created an issue. Transparency during the application process. Again, that was a common theme, like a lot of jurisdictions or people who were referring people to apply for aid. Everyone pretty much came back and said it really wasn't clear on, you know, what the process was, who to send folks to. And sometimes it created that back and forth of them sending someone to a resource and then that client coming back to say, hey, they said, you know, X, Y, and Z, and it could have been something different. Distributing payments efficiently. I could have a whole nother webinar about that, but just to keep it short for the purpose of this, just making sure, like one of the common things is just making sure the payments went out efficiently and effectively to the landlords or to the clients, whatever it was. There were a lot of confusion around that with whether or not landlords had to accept payments. And then the best way for organizations to directly pay the tenants in the cases where the landlords were refusing to accept the payments from the program. So it was a lot of gray area around that as well. Engaging and collaborating with local stakeholders, including the property owners and rental managers. Again, going back to that second point of one, making sure folks were receiving payment, but two, a lot of folks who we would talk to, another common thing came out was like case management. Because it was a lot of money that folks were getting. And even though we were in a pandemic, it was another common thing that came up was that some of these folks were repeated clients, right? So we had folks coming back multiple times during the 2 to 3 year time span, again, facing the same issue. Granted, you know, some jobs were slow to open back up, but it was more so of like, okay, how can we get these folks wraparound services? So they were kind of preventing them from coming back and needing this assistance again. And then obviously collecting and analyzing data to help refine the program. That was another thing as well, because kind of early on, during the pandemic, there really pretty much wasn't too much data collection going on, for lack of better words. And that kind of happened towards the end of the pandemic, where folks started actually tracking more so efficiently what they were doing. And I think the last common thing we saw was standardized application requirements. Again, going back to our earlier point I just made about how, you know, every organization, some nonprofits, they had different processes and different requirements, and that created confusion. Next slide, Kelly. So again, going back to scenario one, with estimating the need of folks who were at highest risk of displacement. So how we determine who were at higher risk for displacement were one, the percentage of tenants households who would apply for the funding and be approved for the funding, as well as if those applicants, if their landlords would accept the eviction prevention funding. So that's how we came out with the most highest need for those folks who we're thinking kind of going forward, the funding should be targeted for. So Stout estimated for the 2023, out of all the evictions that were filed with a warrant of restitution issued, about 15% of those would meet that definition for the highest risk of displacement that was defined in the study. That equals to about 20 to 25,000 households who would likely have warrants executed against them. Next slide, Kelly. So this is just a graph to kind of highlight what I've just kind of said on the previous slide. So out of the 20 to 25,000 households, Stout kind of estimated that between 12 to 18,000 of those were the ones who would actually apply and qualify for this assistance. And then as you go down, you see kind of like the analysis that kind of came up from this study. which is one, like the estimated rent for both of those categories, and how the estimated rent was determined was using the monthly rent paid by ACE clients. Is how they determined the monthly rent. We estimated that, you know, the new program going forward could pay for 2 months. For example, where we know kind of during the pandemic, I think folks could get, and I don't want to quote, this is Lisa, I feel like they could get like 6 months to 12. It was a lot of months, but we kind of narrowed it down to 2 to 3 months. And then you have the dollar estimates here below. So what's the cost benefit analysis? Again, for every dollar spent, there's a $2 to $2.64 return in investment. We want to keep saying that 100 times. And there's a lot of different things, right? One, like housing is tied to a lot of different things in our society, in our economy, right? So when folks are housed, they could focus on employment. When folks are housed, they could focus on education, getting their kids to school. Kids have somewhere to lay their head, do their homework. When folks are housed, there's a less need for Medicaid and healthcare spending because they are housed and they have somewhere to go to store their medications and be safe. Next slide. The next slide just continues on again, talking about the cost benefits. There's been, we found that there was actually a decrease in the need for unemployment and different public assistance, as well as a decrease for foster care and costs because we don't have children that are displaced, right? As well as a decrease in incarceration costs because we don't have folks out here reoffending just to make ends meet, right? One thing I do want to highlight, though, that we have here in the notes is that the cost benefit analysis, this is like the best that we could come up with, given our unique situation here. So one of the things that we came up with is one, we don't really track eviction data as we should, right? So that's always been a challenge for a number of years. Two, the fact that Maryland, we are kind of unique in the sense that we have the right to redeem properties once it's paid. Like I believe some of those were not factored into these numbers. So in that case, the numbers could be a little bit higher than this, right? Or maybe, you know, either higher or maybe a little bit lower, depending on the situation, as the folks who did have the right to redeem did not have to like go into some of those safety nets that we offer, like the housing and unemployment and shelters and things of that nature. So the cost is a little bit different there. Next slide.
I think this is.
Yeah, I think, yep, this is go ahead to Matt. I think Matt can take over.
All right. Thank you, Tanika. So again, my name is Matt Hill. I'm attorney at Public Justice Center, and piggybacking off the study that Tanika just went through, our group came up with a campaign, and how can we actually make this happen in Maryland? And so first, just to visualize the point Tanika was just making, which is that eviction prevention funds mean everything, right? Because housing is foundational, and it's intersectional with less foster care, preventing homelessness, education stability, better health care, maintaining your job, and kind of really highlighting that intersectionality as we talk about eviction prevention going forward. Next slide. Focusing at the moment on education, right? Preventing eviction stabilizes the family, the school, the community. Families cannot thrive without safe, stable housing. Schools cannot thrive with a student body forced to live in unstable and deplorable conditions. Raises a question too around the investment in the blueprint for Maryland's future, right? The state's spending billions of dollars, but the wraparound services in community schools that are receiving many of these funds do not currently include any sort of housing stability support. And as Lisa was just talking about, there really is no other source of eviction prevention funds anymore in the state. And so that is a major concern we're going to come back to in just a moment. I want to speak about Miss Magdalena Escobar there, whose smiling face you see. Magdalena is a CASA member, is one of our coalition partners. You know, her husband lost hours at his job. And then she had to quit her job that was in the food industry in order to take care of the needs of one of her sons who developed a significant illness. And so the family fell really far behind on the rent. Luckily, they still had some state ERAP money in Prince George's County where she lives. She was able to apply with assistance from CASA, and just recently had all the rent paid. And it was just a huge burden lifted from her shoulders as well as from her kids' shoulders. I mean, she talked quite a bit, and we put a couple of video clips up on our website about how the pending eviction had affected them, how all the papers posted on the door that the kids would go to school worried and asking, hey, are we going to come back and find all of our stuff out in the front yard? And so that really affected them. And Ms. Escobar is very compelling about how this eviction prevention money really changed their lives, especially of the kids. Next slide. We've talked a little bit about, righting racial wrongs. This is a big theme for the Moore administration. We think it fits really well into that priority. And that's because eviction prevention funds do really reach folks who are Black and households that are female-led. The current eviction prevention funds program from the pandemic helped over 100,000 households. 73% identify as Black, 71% identify as being female-led. We know why this is, right? We know that centuries of discrimination, institutionalized racism have meant, in our housing economy in particular, have pushed Black folks into certain situations where they are constantly closer to the edge of eviction and financially insecure in rental households. And so these eviction prevention funds are critical to help them maintain stability in the current economy. That's a couple of my clients, Sylvia Duvall and Abdul Muhammad in Baltimore, and they recently received eviction prevention funds from the United Way, luckily. As part of our study, we did map the evictions in Maryland. And so if you want to look at a map by census tract, by race, it's linked there in the PowerPoint, which we'll be making available online, along with a link to a recording of this presentation. And I think Lisa already covered this, but just really stunning data to reinforce that 1 in 4 Black children in rental households face the threat of eviction in a typical year. Next slide. We talked a little bit about the intersection with healthcare. Tanika mentioned Medicaid. We talked with Craig Pollock at Hopkins, and just really highlighting that you cannot take care of yourself. You can't take your medicines. You can't really address acute medical needs when you are homeless, when you've been evicted. And so keeping people in their homes is actually a lot less expensive than folks having to constantly go to the emergency room or missing their medications, which then means that they're going to accrue additional needs and additional health problems. Again, talking about foster care, David Wanger, Maryland Office of the Public Defender, he sees eviction, homelessness as one of the driving factors behind many family separations. And again, when that happens, the state is paying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a year for the variety of foster parents, attorneys, social workers that are required in the foster care system. Much less expensive to the state to simply keep people in their homes. Next slide. So what are we asking for? I've been asking for $15 million in a budget allocation for this coming fiscal year, FY25, for the Homelessness Solutions Program. And based on Stout's estimates, that would assist 5,620 families in avoiding eviction. Secondly, and I apologize for my poor numbered bullets, but it's supporting SB 370, HB 428, which is a bill from Senator Hettleman and Delegate Stewart that would establish an eviction funds program in community schools with a mandatory budget allocation each year. Next slide. Talking a little bit more about that bill. Of course, see Magdalena's smiling face again. really focused on community schools. Going back to that point made earlier about the fact that we're investing billions into community schools, into families in community schools. But if kids are evicted from those community schools, from the neighborhood around those community schools, they're going to lose that support network potentially, or make it much more difficult for them to access that helps them with transportation, healthcare, counseling, and healthy food. So it's really about also protecting the investment that Maryland's making in families in community schools. Next slide. And so I think we've covered this a little bit before, and then so the community schools based program is also, I think it's in flux at the moment, but it's going to be a collaboration between the Maryland State Department of Education and the Department of Housing and Community Development, as I understand it. And then they're looking for a mandatory allocation of $10 million in FY26. And I understand from the sponsors, they're looking for some way to jumpstart that through the FY25 budget process. Next slide. And that's our contact information. And then once again, a link to the study, the analysis that you saw a lot of the graphics from right there, which will also include a link to the recording of this presentation. And then finally, I just have a lot of people to thank. I think the ABLE Foundation, the Casey Foundation, United Way of Maryland that provided funding for the Stout study and for some of the ongoing campaign work. And then also Advance Maryland, which helped create some of the great graphics that we've been using today. So thank you very much. And I think I'll turn it back to Masab.
Yep, thanks so much, Matt, and thanks to Lisa, Tanika, and Matt, our panelists, for a great presentation. Not only just highlighting the benefits, the fiscal benefits for preventing evictions, but also putting a well-needed, face behind all those numbers. And so we can see that this is affecting real people. We have the Q&A chat for questions. We'll be happy to hang around here and answer any questions that you all have. I'm not sure if we're allowed to have folks go off mute, but any case, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And Callie said, if people would rather speak, they can raise their hand and she will unmute you. If that works better, feel free to do that. And it looks like we have a question here. Copy of a slides and recording, so we will provide the link for that. It'll all be on the landing page for the report. I believe they're doing that right now. And in the chat, you can find the landing page for the study. Thanks for posting that, Callie. Doesn't seem like we have too many questions, but we definitely want to encourage you to reach out to us, either one of the panelists, to if you have any questions or follow up or want follow-up details, or if you read the report and come across with extra questions, feel free to reach out to us. I'm wondering if we can put our contact list in the chat. But if there's no further questions, we can wrap this up, give everyone else their time back. I will quickly, oh, sorry, wanted to post the contact list real quick. I don't see where I can tag everybody. Oh, looks like we have two questions here, actually. I'll start with Dan Piper. Yes, Dan. Dan's talking about their experience with the UI system and being homelessness, and this is precisely what we want to prevent. And with adding funding to this legislation, to the ask for the budget assembly, to be able to prevent outcomes such as yours. And we really appreciate you sharing that with us. I think Callie put the contact list in the chat. Thank you for that. So yeah, I think if that is it, we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining. And again, please feel free to contact us if you have any additional questions. And everything, the slides and the recording will be sent out in an email post, the recording. All right.